were appointed on the Defense Health Board by the Secretary of Defense. Talk to us a little bit about that, what that appointment was like, what it means to you, and just how does that even go about, you being contacted by, or appointed by the Secretary of Defense on the Defense Health Board?
Well, it was about 2 years in the making, and of course, COVID had a hand in not getting us up and running as much as we would like. But the Defense Health Board is what is part of what we would call a FACA, F-A-C-A. I'm not cursing. It is a group of, I would say, volunteer group of professionals who really provide kind of insight, decisions, or support, I should say, support to whichever the agency may be. So most of I think roughly around the 70s, the Federal Advisory Committee Act was created. And what they basically form are kind of committees around key elements of a governmental agency, for example, who provide advice and guidance to the secretary or the principal officer related to the agency. So, for example, there's a FACA there's several federal advisory committees for, let's say, FDA, for CDC. In fact, you may have heard of one called ACIP, which essentially is the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices. And that's the group that when they say, well, CDC has approved or their recommendation to approve a certain vaccine, that's the FACA that comes in and provides that support to the CDC to say, make its determination, and for the director to make their assessment and their decisions. So likewise, the Defense Health Board is a FACA for the Secretary of Defense. And primarily, the way this all came about, I did have a meeting. I believe I was at the Pentagon probably about a couple years back. And, we were talking about military health or just health assessments in that regard. And especially when dealing with families and communities that are around the military, I would say, sector, one of the concepts has really been for me, I remember speaking up in the meeting about better integration at the local level, what's being done at the Department of Defense so that they're not in a silo. And one of the worst things that we can ever have in health and safety is silos. So, having a better integration was one of the suggestions or commentary that I had specifically around how best to connect the local jurisdictions with the various installations, especially since people get their health care all across the country. So because I opened my mouth, I think one of the leaders there said, hey, you have a lot of good ideas. Maybe we should talk to you about, being on the Defense Health Board. And I was like, yeah, whatever. We'll see what happens. Because these things take time. They have to go through review. There needs to be not only approval by the higher level, also what goes up to the executive branch, and as far as their approval of things as well. So I was able to get a call about 2 years later and said, hey, you remember we told you this is going to be a long process. And I finally got notice that I was going to be appointed in late December. So it's been a shock. It's been, a significant milestone. And I'm really looking forward to being able to provide my expertise on both in public health or all things health in a way that help our country. So it's an interesting scenario.
As a I got to say though, as a Freemason, I would think you would know better. If you're ever at a meeting and you suggest anything, next thing you know, you're on the committee and you're the chair to get that done. You never make suggestions if you don't want any extra work to do.
Yeah, well, that's I think I've sung that mantra enough times. But in my field of work, it's always a team sport. So anyone who knows me knows that I always speak up and say, and make suggestions. So it's always funny though. It's the irony. My staff, especially my previous staff, would say, never go into Oscar's office and make a suggestion or come up with an idea, because at least an hour or two after you've left his office, he's already either cleared the way to make it work or made it work and put it and said, hey, now run with it. So it was one of those scenarios where I guess, I get my own medicine back.
You brought up an interesting point, though, in your answer, which I think might be relevant to Freemasonry, but just organizations in general. The tendency for groups and organizations to kind of build either within themselves or just against a larger community, silos, and the tendency for groups to become very insular and not necessarily work together or work with other organizations or share information. To what extent do you think that siloing is just a natural tendency of groups and organizations? And how does a group and organization go about fighting? If it is a natural tendency, how do you go about fighting it so that you avoid, so you're able to maintain communication and working together and integration at different levels?
I'll argue it shouldn't be a natural tendency, just given the mission, the aims, the goals of even an organization like Freemasonry, and specifically any kind of community-based, societal organization or social-based organization that, in enveloping or encasing oneself in a silo, it should never be the natural tendency. But it is, and oftentimes as a result of either, as I would say, sometimes the pride, the ego, and the other things that come into play. Why I also believe it should never be a natural tendency is given the perspective of trying to do good, trying to share information and provide enlightenment and support, the community service element. These are all pieces that are best worked when you're in a collaborative. Remember, I mentioned before being in a team sport environment. And so in a collaborative, whether, and I'm just going to use Freemason, for example, whether you're in a craft lodge setting, and then how do you interact with other pennant concordant bodies, or even when you're in a craft lodge setting and you're in a district, so there's more than one lodge, and how do you best work together? I mean, I've been in scenarios where, you've been in a district and, one lodge says, they don't care what is going on in the district. We're just going to stick within our four walls, or our community. And then even from the external perspective of, people talk about a heyday of Freemasonry around how, we attracted men from all walks of life, and we were a vibrant central component of activity. Somewhat, I would say, as a result of the focus that we have in Freemasonry, but any type of social uplift organization should be well vetted and well vested in their community. So it shouldn't be a surprise to say, well, this person is this, this person is that, but by virtue of working. So whether you're in a big town, a small village, or a big city, as we would say, the grasping folks who are embedded in the pulse of the communities which they live is going to be important. And we saw this, I would say, the other side of that coin, especially in American Freemasonry, when we saw the rise of large municipalities and the cost of living with respect to the buildings that folks own. And you heard about the flight of many of the Masonic organizations to leave the big cities because it got too expensive, or build into the suburbs, or basically outgrowing where they pretty much set their stone. So the irony in that regard is that we've seen scenarios where the community has grown into a certain perspective, but the organization has not, or the lodge or has not, or the grouping, hasn't necessarily done that interaction. So if you want to build a collaborative environment, whether one is collaboration within the fraternal side or between the community element, there are pieces of this that's more than just focus on the internal building of oneself as a man and as a contributor to society, but that one recognize that social and moral obligation, which we say in our ritual and in our conversation, that we owe society as a whole. And it's more than just saying, we're going to donate money, or we're going to, go have a soup kitchen, but there has to be a well vetted integration and collaboration if we're truly going to be effective and progress as a population and as a society.
And that goes to, perhaps the biggest struggle in Freemasonry and without Freemasonry in society right now, which is, and I've talked about this with other Masons, the vaccines is a good example of it, though it's in other areas as well. That conflict between considering and acting in a manner that's best for society versus sometimes, respecting individual freedoms. I myself am, I guess double vaxxed and boosted. And I've been promoting very hard the importance of getting vaccinated, on the podcast, because I think it's, my opinion, and I'll get in trouble because I've already got in trouble once for saying this, but in my opinion, getting vaccinated really is the Masonic thing to do. But I've said that on social media and posted it, and I've got some shade thrown back at me about that. I guess my question is, as Freemasons, or just individuals in society, how do we navigate those types of battles that seem to be popping up more and more in social media feeds? Whether or not they're in real life, I don't know, but they seem to exist a lot in social media, and I have seen some of those conflicts spill over into Masonic circles and Masonic lodges.
Yeah, it's real life, and it's an unfortunate testimony of where we really are versus where we profess to be. So has been illustrated with these last 2 years in a spirit of the divisiveness and, as I would say, the human frailties of life, as we call it, or the human failings, have become front and center, and oftentimes they're defended, and depending on which perspective, but positions are defended as you just kind of color them, individual freedoms, common sense and decency, civility, obligations both to be in the spirit of truth and responsibility, especially that of social responsibility. And I think that's one that was the biggest beacon for me personally. You see, as you kind of articulated, in my day-to-day world, I'm constantly, and I've been this way for a period of time, I'm constantly on the forefront of addressing diseases, pestilence, trying to help community live better, healthier lives, individuals as well. And I always, it took my lodge when I first joined about a year and a half before they really sat me down and asked me, what the heck is an epidemiologist? Because I had no idea. Now everybody knows what an epidemiologist is, right? But it was so funny because they were struggling just even to pronounce the word. And when I finally explained what I did, you could see like, oh, wow, like I had no idea. So I say that because being on the front line of even the disaster response and, this pandemic response, day in, day out, whether you're in the situation rooms, you're having White House briefings, you're speaking daily with the CDC, you're trying to, help and provide support to those people on the ground who are literally, eating, breathing, and trying to do their best to keep communities afloat. It was so frustrating to leave that world and go into another world where people are questioning the very same things that you are doing each day to save their lives every day. So I got to the point of recognizing, especially as it pertains to risk communication and health communication, just trying to just share the facts. As an epidemiologist, you share the facts, and you would hope, and my aspiration is probably similar to yours in the sense that as a Freemason, we have an obligation, we have a duty to truth. We have a duty to embrace not only truth and enlightenment, but share that with communities and others who are traveling this path before us. So I began to basically provide information. And what was so intriguing was the fact that oftentimes there were people who were so in one particular bucket or one particular, perspective, and they were just ardently just coming to argue and, dispel the simple facts that, that I thought I was trying to share. And oftentimes these were people who, the majority of the times, were Freemasons, not even folks that I had outside of the Masonic circles. So now I was sitting in the midst of the war room and trying to help respond and provide education and awareness, and having to battle, on our perspective, seeming to have to battle, my own brothers and not all of them, but there were some who were very vocal and loud and unfortunately wrong. That this is a hoax, or this is made up, or this person was this, or all this other things, and things that were, it took so much energy to be doing what I do every day, and then to come out and just try to help explain what I do every day, but from a lens that hopefully the community and individuals have a better understanding. And it didn't always work. There are some folks where I recognize that I will never have these conversations with them ever at all, because they're not going to change their position. So to your point, is it a Masonic thing to do? I think anything that says that we are trying to do our best to help to maintain the health and safety of those around us is the Masonic thing to do. Does everyone believe that the Masonic thing to do is equal to the act of being vaccinated in the middle of a global pandemic that is destroying our communities and society? Obviously not everyone feels that way. There's the varying level of risk or I should say perspectives that are shared. So the ultimate goal, I would say, a recommendation that I would say is just say what you say when you can. Recognize that different people respond to different messages or different impulses, and hope for the best. And at the end of the day, whether through individual choice, people have a right to make their own decisions. They have a right, their own free will and accord, as we say. We will just hope that we can come out and that at least history is at least polite to us, because the stories that I can imagine that will come out from this generations from now are not going to be polite to how we've responded and acted and come together or not come together as a people.
Yeah, and I really like what you said, and it's something I've done. With both people within the craft and just people without the craft is, you have to pick a point where, if you realize there's not going to be any movement from one side to the other, you just have to, there's a point where you have to just stop the conversation and talk about something else, because if you just end up in this feedback loop, and even within, Freemasonry, there's a point where, you just got to pick your battles, kind of thing. You can't fight them all the time. And in your case, like, as you talked about, right, with your day-to-day job, you're already fighting that battle, and then having to refight it in your personal life. I mean, that's got to be, at our last interview, I remember ending it by saying I didn't envy your job because we were in the middle of the pandemic, and I still don't envy the work you had to do. I'm sure it was exhausting, but I'm also sure it had its rewarding moments as well. Can you talk about some of that a little bit? Some of the more rewarding times you've had during the last couple of years with your job working with the healthcare professionals?
So I can tell you several high points. Being able to help both leverage the local needs to really get their voices heard, as far as what local jurisdictions were looking for and how they best can be supported. Being able to really try.
Actually, I want to keep on that for a moment, because I like that. Even from a Masonic perspective, how did you go about working and making sure local communities got their voices heard? Because even in Freemasonry in Ontario, for example, a lot of lodges will complain that their issues don't make it up the chain, to the provincial, to our Grand Lodge. So how did you go about making sure that local voices were heard, especially during a pandemic when there's a lot of people, trying to be heard all at once?
So one of the things that, my strategy and how at least when I was at NATCHO, how that member organization worked, is that we identify or even request that folks from varying communities, and whether they're small, medium, or large jurisdictions, to provide that feedback loop as to what are you hearing, what are you seeing, what are your principal concerns. We also provided like webinars, very clearly webinars, phone calls, email distribution, letting them know as well, as far as here's an opportunity to speak with this particular leader on this topic. Oh, there's someone doing contact tracing. We're going to talk about not only the support that happened in contact tracing and the successes, but what are the pitfalls so you don't have to have them as well. There's some guidance coming in around schools. Okay, we're going to bring those experts to you this Thursday and make sure that you have an opportunity to not only showcase what you're doing with your local jurisdiction, but what is coming down the pipeline. So engaging with folks was really helpful, especially when we needed to, on a moment's notice, say, we need you to take a look at this new guidance that's being suggested that's going to roll out in about a day or two. But we need you to keep this confidential so that you let us know, does this work or does it not work? So that type of a trusted partnership and leadership, not only speaking to the local communities, but bringing their voices and being their representative, was very instrumental. On the Masonic side, one could actually say the same could be done by any individual, whether it's a group of lodges or districts, speaking with a liaison, or even through the provincial or however the district perspectives, to make sure that the issues that are pertinent to what's on the ground is being reflected in the broader regional and as well as the Grand Lodge leadership. When I was junior Grand Warden, I had a liaison with about 12 to 15 different districts across New York State. And, I would host meetings with the district deputies and just basically say, this is the opportunity to share what are some of the concerns that you're hearing, identify and speak to those brothers as well, and identify what are some bi-directional conversations that we should be having, and how to, at least if I don't have an answer, go locate the answer and make sure we're very rapid in the response and the feedback. And that's an important lesson I think anyone can incorporate, whether it's in the Masonic world or the non-Masonic world. And I found that to be very helpful because in my years of being a local epidemiologist and, speaking up at state meetings or national meetings, having that opportunity to know that there's an advocate in the leadership that will help and ensure that your voices are at least, and there's an answer to questions that are available, has been really instrumental.
And then I cut you off before. So some of the other high points in the last couple of years. One
particular high point, I would say, second one, we were able to get, after, hearing all the things that were happening with guidance and not being at the table for certain items, we were able to help orchestrate participation in White House calls, which was really helpful because we're able to discuss directly while folks were planning at this level to say, this is what's happening on the ground and we need better visibility. And at least you can hear directly from the folks who are on the ground. So I can remember tons of locals. I think they told me in the U.S., you have roughly about 3,000 local city health departments. So I obviously can't invite 3,000 health departments. But I remember one time we were able to, I think, invite about 100 or so. And when I started making the calls and just, getting folks on those calls, it was a, Friday, evening time. I can recall that everyone dialing in and saying that you hear who was from a local, and the questions that they asked the national leadership was so poignant, and give me a sense of pride to know that I was able to get folks in a room at the highest level to really talk about their reaction to things and to raise and to actually open the doors in some cases when they were getting roadblocks to get things accomplished. The third was the development of a contact tracing software that's called SerAlert. And I was in the room providing some expertise when it was being built. And at the end of the day, I think it has tracked across about 20 different jurisdictions through the pandemic, including Puerto Rico and others. Over 8 million, I believe, 8 million folks have been, have been through that system for contact tracing for COVID. So that in of itself has really been, significant to know that you played a role in getting something created and implemented and utilized in a way that just, has helped people immensely. So those are some 3 touch points that I would quickly say have been rewarding.
That's it's good to hear about those as well, because I think everybody's very well aware of kind of some of the challenges or the many challenges, but there's also been a lot of really good work done by a lot of individuals, yourself included, right, who have as best as we can helped to make this pandemic a little bit easier as much as anything can be. Do you speaking of, one word I'm hearing a lot more of lately, and I can kind of guess what it means based on the context of it, but with your expertise, you may be able to help navigate this word more. Is I'm hearing a lot more of the word endemic over the past few months in media, on social media. What is the difference between when something is endemic versus a pandemic? And is that, it always seems like endemic is spoken in a vaguely hopeful way, which I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not, but to my understanding, endemic just means it becomes like a cold or flu. Is that the case, or?
Yeah, that's how people are trying to describe endemic. So I'll say it this way: you can have what is called Immersion. So a disease that hasn't been seen in a particular area, it becomes an emergent disease. It's grown. So I'll use West Nile as an example. So West Nile virus was not in the North America area, until the 2000s. And what happened basically, some areas got infected with West Nile. So you started to see emergent outbreaks associated with West Nile virus. The other piece, the other piece that's important, moving from emergent is kind of like into the outbreak, is to the perspective of where things become regional and there's more than one location that's having this particular outbreak. Then you transition that into what we call pandemic. Pandemic, when you have a disease that hasn't been identified before in the population, it's spread very rapidly. There's no treatment that really can help stop it immediately, and that it has grown. It has grown to several different portions of the world. So COVID in December was not a pandemic till it starts spreading to all of these different countries and really having a very rapid spread. They didn't have any kind of therapeutics at the time to really treat it, and they very, very clearly didn't have vaccines. Where people are making the shift into endemic is probably a misutilization of the word or misunderstanding of it. A disease like West Nile, which was emergent, went into outbreak and spread to several countries, but became sustained in an area that it wasn't before. So, for example, you would have West Nile outbreaks in Florida, New York, and it spread across the country. I believe you guys had it as well in Toronto and places like that. And it was a new disease, but over the course of time, it became sustained in that population, meaning it's not new anymore. It's here to stay. It's been growing every year. You can expect to find cases to that extent. So endemic pretty much means Now you don't have a new disease, but this disease is sustained in the geography where you are. Now, fast forward that to COVID. COVID has been here for going on 2 years, and it very clearly shows that it's going to be here for a little while longer. It's not going away. So one can argue that at a period of time, we will believe that COVID will be endemic to a region or endemic to a population or endemic to a location, whether it be the world, Canada, the US. So the problem is when folks are saying, oh, it's endemic, so therefore we don't have to do anything. That's not the case. Endemic really just describes the fact that you can expect to find this particular disease in this location, and it's not new anymore. So does that mean that you no longer employ techniques to try to stop them? No, it doesn't mean that. Does that mean that means everyone's going to get it, so therefore you do nothing? No. I used the argument to someone the other day that, we warn you cross the street on a red light, you have a run chance of getting hit by a car. But you're not going to say, well, let's just hit everybody by a car because sooner or later someone's going to get hit by a car. That's kind of the approach that people have taken to say, well, it's endemic. That means everyone's going to get it, so we don't have to do anything. So that's the only word of caution that I would say in an attempt to understand what the term endemic means. Not that it's the end of this particular issue, but that it's a much more sustained existence of the disease in a population or a region.
As a as a doctor and as a Freemason, one thing I wanted to talk to you about and get your opinion on is, one thing it has concerned me a little bit about a lot of the messaging around COVID, but even before COVID to a certain extent. But with COVID, a lot of emphasis, and I think rightly so, being placed on vaccinations, which I think everybody should be vaccinated, masks, things like that. But I haven't heard as much emphasis placed on, I don't know if it's because it's not as effective against COVID or what, but placed on just physical health measures in general. And, one thing, even as a Freemason, I've tried to incorporate recently into Lodge is, thinking about some health measures we can implement in Freemasonry, even something like, breathing exercises and meditation exercises and, yoga and stretching in Lodge, to maybe we don't have to eat pizza and donuts at the end of every meeting. Taking care of our health, especially for some of our older members who are immunocompromised, that seems like something that Freemasons could be doing more of, is thinking about the general health of our membership and focusing on that, as well as the other public health measures.
One of the things when I was in the chairs going through the chairs to become master of my lodge, and I was junior warden, one of the things that bothered me as a health professional was seeing how poor our eating habits were. Masons love to eat, and sometimes love to eat poorly. Physical activity was not one that seemed to be enjoyed by most. I was able to at least change when we ate at our meeting. So oftentimes we would meet. The lodge opens up and closes, and then folks, eat or, after the lodge meeting. Now it's late at night, you're going home, you have some travel. So I just made a suggestion that maybe we change our dinners to before the meeting, maybe 6 o'clock, 6:30. That way, folks had some time to come, after work, get a meal, fellowship. We can meet new potential candidates, have that kind of dialogue and discussion, and then we can go into our meeting. Some would argue, like, yeah, but if they're fed, then they're going to go to meeting, they're going to fall asleep on you. And I'm like, there's just some minor wins that one can get, recognizing that we're not going to turn the lodge into Planet Fitness, right? We would like to, and as you mentioned, there may be elements that are going to be important, but it all pertains into the culture, into the understanding, and to the the way you message and encourage that type of activity. So does it require an in-depth breathing exercise that doesn't require any kind of physical manipulation, that just even the act of standing and sitting and breathing in deeply, just getting folks, acclimatized to that, appreciative of it, can go a long way. I would always caution that brothers don't try to do too much at once, because everyone comes from different perspectives, different speeds, and different, the different abilities. So there is an element of wellness that is important, that needs to be stressed in several aspects, whether in our real world lives or in the Masonic perspective. But I think ultimately illustrating through example and practice are one of the ways that I think you have the greatest influence. Because otherwise, as I say, people will, divert into what is their particular comfort zone.
So, one thing we talked about quickly offline, that I wanted to ask you about, or talk to you about. I've been seeing, unfortunately, a lot on Facebook, a lot of my Masonic friends posting regarding the passing of a brother, Tom Jackson. I didn't know him myself, but a lot of my Masonic contacts from across America, and as you point out, around the world, have mentioned his passing and have mentioned his Masonic career. So I wonder if you have anything you can tell us about Brother Tom Jackson. Was he in the New York jurisdiction?
No, Tom Jackson was a Pennsylvania Mason, and
Pennsylvania.
and a proud Pennsylvania Mason at that. That was, Tom was a Masons, if you can understand where I'm going with that. He was from what you probably call a rural area of Pittsburgh, of Pennsylvania, called Shippensburg. He was very much very well known in Freemasonry because he served for about 20 years as the Grand Secretary of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. And what was important, for 16 years, he was the first executive secretary of the World Conference of Masonic Grand Lodges. So think about that for a perspective. Not only was he a principal foundation within the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, but he had the exciting world view perspective of being the executive secretary for the regular Grand Lodges, who meet on I think a biannual basis across the world. So as a result of that, he was able to both provide some influence, some wisdom, some support to jurisdictions across the world. And it's said that he had membership in about 111 honorary memberships in 111 Grand Lodges across the world. He's so unique in the sense that he was on a postage stamp in Brazil. He had lodges named after him, and he was very active in Freemasonry for an extended period of time. He was an avid writer and supporter of education, and speaking at least to the plight of American Masonry and directions that are going to be important for its growth and development, and this opportunity to turn around from a spirit of growth and development. So I would tell you, if you're able to purchase any of the books that he wrote about his different speeches and papers. I know Tom by virtue of my own travel and going to all these places around the world, and running into Tom, and he would wag his finger at me and he goes, "You're about to become as well traveled as I am." And I would joke because I knew he was everywhere and there was no way I was going to catch up to him. But he was really a kind-hearted gentleman. He had a very formidable voice. He was very short in stature, but he had this voice where you knew it was Tom Jackson speaking, and that commanded both the presence and respect. I served, I was elected to be a member of the Council of Nine Muses, which is basically a a group of 9 brothers and scholars who essentially there's 9 people within this council of the AMD, when you're basically a life member. So the only way you replace a member is when an individual dies, unfortunately. So Tom was the master of that council, and just even in our conversations over the course of time, on the phone or in person, of course, prior to COVID, he's really left a significant mark in Freemasonry, and it was tragic to hear of his passing. But in my conversation with him, this summer, he had pretty much been at comfort with his contributions and his path, and his cancer had some resurgence. But when I would talk to him, he was ready to go, even though the rest of us weren't ready for him to be gone.
He sounds like somebody definitely would be great to have met, but it sounds like his work would be great for any Mason to check out. Is it available on Amazon, or how would you go about finding some of his works?
Yeah, let me see if I find a link and send it to you.
And I will throw that link down in the description to the video.
Yep. Yep, he does have. So one of his books is the Northern American Freemasonry, Idealism and Realism, and that you can find that on Amazon. I'll drop that to you as well, so that way you can share. But there, you can find whether the books are available under Tom's handwriting, as they would say.
Perfect. So any brethren out there, especially if you're, any Mason, but if you're a lodge secretary, or if you're with Masonic Temple, like one of the caretakers, or on the board for the temple, consider picking one up for your Masonic library, so brothers can check it out when they're there waiting for a meeting to start. If they got some downtime, it's always good to have, well-stocked shelves in a Masonic temple. And there it is. I'll put that in the description for Sir Masonic Perspectives, the Grand Secretary. And just before we finish up, my worship, sir, you mentioned at the start there's been some changes in the last 6 months. So what are you working on right now, your new position, and what is coming up in the future for you, outside of once again, the very impressive appointment that you just had to the I can't think of it now, the Defense Health Council?
Well, tons of work, of course, with testing, diagnostics, and just trying to keep things afloat. We have tons of Masonic activities, and of course, in light of where we are with the pandemic, trying to be both smart and fruitful, and secure, in ensuring that we can at least turn this corner. So, speaking engagements, of course, there are Masonic groups that I've been participating in, and just trying to, keep that balance, that work life and personal balance in good stride, right? So it's been good. Of course, everyone has their challenges that they face on a daily basis. I'm no different than anyone else. So just really trying to keep a positive mental attitude and forging ahead.
Well, you say you're no different than anybody else, but you definitely put in the work of at least a couple people, maybe 3 or 4. So thank you for that. And thank you again for being on the Square and Compass podcast.
No problem. Thank you, my brother, and you enjoy.